Give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted. This is a statement that's popularly attributed to Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, although it is suspect if he ever actually said this specifically. But whether he did or not is irrelevant. The statement exemplifies the importance that the Soviet Union placed on education. Sure, it was an education system that was used for indoctrination, but to a degree, all education systems do that. I'm your host David, and today we're going to talk about the Soviet education system with a particular look at the reforms instituted by Khrushchev in the 1950s. This is the Cold War. I've learned in my venerable age that sleep is extremely important, so I am glad to be using the sponsor of this video, Endel, a uniquely useful application that creates personalized soundscapes to help you focus, relax, or sleep. If you're having a hard time focusing on your studies or work, if you suffer from stress and anxiety making you unproductive, or are having trouble sleeping so you feel tired through the day, Endel is the solution you have been looking for. Its patented technology creating personalized soundscapes for every user is backed by neuroscience. The app reacts to inputs throughout the day, like the weather, your heart rate, and even location, and helps you focus, relax, or sleep. Its relax mode calms your mind and creates a feeling of comfort and safety, while focus boosts your productivity, allowing you to concentrate for longer periods of time. In our opinion, the sleep mode is its best function, as it soothes the user into a deep sleep with soft, gentle sounds. Endel also features a soundscape complementing famous lectures by the writer and speaker Alan Watts. Get inspired with a soothing and motivating soundscape infused with the perspective-changing words of Alan Watts. Endel has a special offer for our viewers. The first 100 people to download Endel using the link in the description will get a free week of audio experiences. This will also support our channel. Since the inception of the Soviet Union, one of the key stated goals proclaimed by the new worker state was free and compulsory education for all citizens. This meant all citizens, irrespective of social status, gender, or even if they wanted to study or not. People had to go to school. After all, in theory, the more education a person has, the more options become open to them in terms of further skills and production capability. So compulsory education was good for the worker and good for the state, right? Well, yes, but also a literate population was easier to direct propaganda towards. It was deemed crucial that Soviet citizens be able to read so they could absorb Marxist propaganda, ensuring they were aware of the main tenets of Marxist teachings. So how is the education system structured? Well, it started even from preschool. The Soviet Union developed a widespread network of preschools and kindergartens, which were actively used by Soviet citizens. Children were accepted into these preschools from as young as 2 months old. The purpose of this, of course, was allowing women to remain in the workforce and therefore increase production for the state. And the preschools proved to be very popular and were actively used by families where women wanted to remain in the workforce. The additional salary was very often a welcome, often needed addition to the monthly budget, of course. Children would remain in preschool until they reached the age of 6, at which point they would begin primary school. Since 1932, primary school consisted of 4 years of schooling, followed by 3 years of secondary school, and then followed again by 3 years of high school or vocational school, depending on the choice of the student. With that 1932 structure came a mandatory 7 years of schooling for all Soviet children, with university or vocational school optional. What resulted from this was a dramatic increase in the number of citizens who stayed in school and received an education. The knock-on effect from this, however, was a drop in the number of citizens entering the labor force, something that the 1930s Soviet Union desperately needed. So to counteract this, in 1940, tuitions were introduced for any student wishing to continue their education past the mandatory 7 years. High school and vocational school tuitions varied depending where the school was located. In Moscow and Leningrad and the capitals of the republics, tuition was 200 rubles, while in most other places it was 150 rubles, about 10% of a worker's annual wage. University tuition was more, ranging between 300 and 500 rubles per year. These tuition fees remained in place until 1956, when they were removed and all education was made free again, a part of the Khrushchev reform package that followed Stalin's death. And speaking of the Lord of the Corn and his reforms, let's take a deeper look at some of them as they relate to education. Like with many aspects of Soviet life, Khrushchev introduced a series of reforms in education designed to improve the lives of everyday citizens, but also with the aim of building a stronger Soviet Union over the long term. For example, 1954 saw the abolition of separate education for boys and girls, which had been introduced in 1943 as part of a deepening conservatism espoused by Stalin and his circle of leadership. But 1958 saw one of the most significant and long-reaching reforms, and it stemmed from that 1956 abolition of tuition fees that I just mentioned. Even before the 1956 reform, the Soviet government, like it had been in the 1930s, was unhappy with the decreasing number of young Soviets entering into industrial and manufacturing jobs once they had completed high school. This was a difficult balance to strike. Khrushchev knew that it was vital for the country to have more skilled and educated scholars, academics, scientists, doctors, and other highly educated members of society in order for the Soviet Union to compete on the world stage. Of course, in order to achieve this, young people delayed their entry into the workforce while they received their education. With the removal of tuition fees, a significant barrier to entry was removed, and more students enrolled into higher education programs. Along with this came a sense, however, that those with more education were further removed and out of touch with the needs and desires of life in the Soviet Union. This sparked a debate that was carried out in both everyday media as well as in academic publications on how best to approach this growing divide. I should point out, of course, that the public debate was still carefully stage managed by the central government, but unlike many policy decisions in the Soviet Union, this one saw some discourse, largely between academic and political circles. And what were the talking points? Well, some people favored extending the length of compulsory education, which could theoretically discourage some people from pursuing higher education, while others talked about the benefits that would come from the introduction of disciplines and classes that would prepare students to enter the workforce with some labor skills already in hand. Khrushchev was also reportedly unhappy with the proportion of university students from the most progressive classes, the proletariat and peasantry, which stood at only 30 to 40%, and he wanted to increase that. What was concluded from the public discourse was that the Soviet education system was largely preparing youth to enter the university system rather than, for lack of a better term, real life. Real life in this case meaning a manufacturing or labor job whose production materially benefits the Soviet state. This conclusion had been reached as early as 1954, when it was recognized just how vital it was to prepare students from an early age to the importance of productive labor. Part of this conclusion was also to find a way of combining education with productive labor for older students in universities. Starting at the beginning of the 1954-1955 school year, new classes were introduced into the curriculum. This included a class called Trud, or labor, for students in the first 4 years of primary school, as well as the introduction of practical lessons held in workshops and practice sites for students in years 5 through 7. From years 8 to 10, practical lessons on mechanical and electrical engineering were offered, as well as classes on agriculture. The following year, 1955, production brigades were formed from students in rural areas who could be used as additional labor when required. All of this was done to help teach children practical skills and introduce them to the Soviet workforce. Okay, so all of these changes and reforms were finalized in 1958 with the introduction of the Law of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on strengthening the connection between school and life and on further development of the system of public education in the USSR. Just rolls right off the tongue. Anyway, the law saw mandatory education extended from 7 to 8 years of schooling and would be enforced across the entire country, something that was accomplished by 1962. A complete education was to be attained over 11 years instead of 10, but we should point out that the 11-year program didn't work as expected, and the 10-year program was reintroduced in 1963. The university entrance system was modified to favor students who had work and labor experience, and even when accepted into university, classes and studying were to be largely done in the evenings, as students in the first 3 years of their programs were expected to have jobs during the day. All of this, introduced by the Reform Law, was designed to ensure that all Soviet citizens had some ability to work in a production job, and even for those destined for jobs in administration or academia and policy, they would have work experience and be familiar with the conditions and realities of other Soviet citizens. This practice of combining education and work was to be employed by the Soviet Union for years to come. Khrushchev made other changes in the education system as well. One of the tools he introduced to help bring education and literacy to all citizens was the Internats, a network of boarding schools. Largely designed for orphans and the children of poor or deprived families, children both lived and went to school in these facilities. Khrushchev really believed strongly in the Internats, as he saw them as a place where the students there, free from the possible negative influences of older generations, who could transfer old ways of thinking and the narrow-minded concerns of daily living. Instead, the Internats would be the, quote, builders of a new society raised under communism. The initial plan when the Internats were introduced was to enroll orphans, children with only one parent, and the children of the poor. Long-term plans were for all Soviet children to be sent to the Internats to be raised and taught. The program started off strongly with over 320,000 students enrolled by 1960. Of course, we should also note that the Internats had the not unintended effect of not only educating youth, but of breaking down ethnic and cultural traditions, creating Soviet citizens regardless of ethnic and cultural background. The Soviet boarding school system is an interesting topic in its own right, especially as the system changed in the 1980s. Let us know in the comments if you're interested in a separate episode about this. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the university system. It too, like so much else in the Soviet Union, was the subject of reformation by the Kukuriznik. The Soviet Union used a centralized university admissions system that was based on a combination of written and oral examinations. But like so many other things in the Soviet Union, and the rest of the world, corruption and nepotism also took on a prominent role in the admissions process. The mujik with the missiles offered a public criticism of this, stating, "Not those who are better prepared get admitted to the universities, but those with influential moms and dads. This is shameful." And following this, in 1957, changes were made. School gold medalists, those students who achieved straight A grades and who had at least 2 years of work experience, would be admitted to university without having to take the examinations. In addition to this change, the path for military conscripts who had completed their service to enter university was also streamlined. Reforms were also made to increase the proportion of university students coming from industrial and agricultural backgrounds. Starting in 1959, kolkhozes, sovkhozes, industrial facilities, and construction sites all had reserved university positions to ensure access. Of course, the flip side to this is that it made it difficult for those without work experience to gain admission to university. This was, you'll remember, one of the goals that Khrushchev wanted to achieve through his reforms: greater and wider access to higher education for those from working class backgrounds. And how successful was this? Well, by 1958, 70% of students enrolled in Soviet universities had at least 2 years of work experience, so generally it was successful in opening more opportunities for more citizens from all walks of life to access higher education while not depriving much needed labor from the workforce. But, and here's the but that you all knew was coming, problems continued to exist in the system. Bribery and nepotism continued to be an issue in the admissions process right until the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was also a decline in the percentage of enrolled students who completed their full programs. For example, of the cohort of students who began their studies in the 1953-54 school year, 79.7% of them graduated. By contrast, of those admitted in the 1959-1960 academic year, only 59% graduated. Some of this could have been the result of student unhappiness with the requirement to both work and study. For many students, despite the salary that they earned, they felt that their jobs impacted their ability to study. They were also often unhappy with the duties they were assigned at their jobs, as they tended to be the most physically demanding. But there was arguably one overarching problem in the Soviet system which no tweaking or modification was going to alter. That was the Marxist-Leninist ideological framework which underpinned everything and also prevented independent critical thought. The Soviet education system introduced ideological teaching starting as early as primary school and continued throughout a citizen's entire education. In addition, there were 3 state-sanctioned extracurricular organizations for school and university students, all designed with ideological indoctrination in mind. The first was the Little Octoberists. The organization was meant for children between 7 and 9 years old, and all children were automatically members. The Little Octoberists laid the ideological groundwork for the next graduated step, the Young Pioneers, which all children were enrolled into at age 9. The Young Pioneer organization was based on the same principles as the Scouting movement found in other parts of the world. Young Pioneers helped to organize sporting events, collect waste paper and metals, did agricultural work, and other similar things. But while the Scouting movement stressed a duty to God, Young Pioneers were brought up with a stress on the principles of communism, Soviet patriotism, and discipline. One of the most famous and often repeated stories of the pioneers, which was designed to exemplify these characteristics, was that of the pioneer Pavel Trofimовich Morozov. As the story goes, in 1932, 13-year-old Pavlik discovered that his father was selling forged documents to bandits and other anti-Soviet elements. Pavlik, as a dedicated and responsible communist, reported his father to the secret police, and the father was promptly sent into the camp system. Pavlik's family, unhappy at this, murdered the boy, a crime for which they were all shot. While the story of Pavlik was held up as an example of loyalty and duty to the state, we should point out that the actual research into the events conducted in the 1980s demonstrated that the story was largely falsified to create a martyr. But why let the truth stand in the way of a good story, right? Okay, beyond the Young Pioneers was the last ideological indoctrination organization, the Comsol, the Communist Youth League. It was open to membership for those between the ages of 14 and 28, but was not mandatory. Membership in the Comsol came with certain responsibilities, including expectations of living a manner which upheld the ideals of the Soviet state and of communist living. The study of the works of communism, including Marx and Lenin, were mandatory. In exchange, however, Comsol members gained certain privileges, including favored access to scholarships and employment opportunities. Active participation in the Comsol was also seen as a necessary step to membership in the Communist Party. The Comsol were organizers of party work, they acted as propaganda tools in the universities and even abroad, and also as eyes and ears reporting on politically unreliable elements to the authorities. By the time of Khrushchev, the Comsol were being used as a weapon to counteract an emerging subculture in Soviet society, the stylyagi. These were young people who dressed in Western styles, listened to Western music, and followed Western culture. Although not illegal, the government saw them as a threat and used the Comsol to help counteract them. Tactics used ranged from public condemnation to physical violence. The ideology and propaganda that was taught through these organizations and through the schools permeated everything. Everything was to be studied through the lens of Marxist-Leninist ideology. This, as you might expect, stifled creative, independent, and critical thought, something which was to have a significant impact on the progress of the Soviet Union as the Cold War progressed. Khrushchev embarked on his reforms of the education system with the best of intentions. After all, don't we all? He was willing to try new concepts and make modifications, keeping what worked and abandoning what didn't. But fundamentally, the ideological constraints forced on the system choked out the significant opportunity for real growth in Soviet education. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and solemnly swear that you solemnly promise to passionately love and cherish the bell button, to live as the great bell button bade us to, as the bell button teaches us to, as required the laws of YouTube. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support would be greatly appreciated via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is the Cold War channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.